Mondays with Mike is a podcast by two friends from the Seattle area. Originally intended as a news analysis podcast, as of spring 2025, it has lately mostly covered current events. Show notes can be found at mondayswithmike.ddns.net. Mondays with Mike is your weekly helping of opinion and critical analysis of the day's news. Bud asks the questions, and Mike supplies the takes. Start a social revolution. Make friends with your neighbor. Disagree without being disagreeable. And remember, if it's Mondays, it's with Mike. There was a video by Forbes, I believe, and Forbes has been doing a lot of just displaying the press conferences or whatever official business said without commentary, which is not a guarantee of no bias because they also have the choice on what to report on. I was thinking about that in the case of this gentleman who allegedly was a surgeon when JFK was brought to the hospital, and he said JFK had 2 bullet wounds, and one of them was in his throat, and the one in his throat was the one that killed him. And he was skeptical of the Warren Commission. So do you want to tell our viewers about the Warren Commission?
Sure. The Warren Commission was the official investigation on what happened with JFK. 1963 is when it was formed by Lyndon B. Johnson, and it disbanded in 1964. So it was a pretty brief commission if we're looking at the actual amount of time that it spent investigating. And the whole point of it was to have an official investigation into what happened and why, and to have a definitive statement to that effect, which it did. It was a huge report. It was 888-page report about what happened in Texas, who they suspected, how they arrived at their conclusions. The major criticism of the commission is that it was very brief, right? That it just wasn't that much time spent on the actual investigation. There's a likely possibility that things were missed or that things were omitted due to the expediency, right? Because ultimately, when you engage in something like truth-seeking, it takes a really long time. Some of the investigations that other countries have done over major events, it goes 5 years, 10 years. And so the reason there's so much controversy for the Warren Commission is because it seemed a bit rushed. And when I say a bit rushed, really rushed. And public polling over the years has been pretty consistent that they think the government didn't answer all the questions about what happened, because the commission arrived at conclusions that it was just one gunman, and they had this theory that it was just one bullet that bounced around a bunch. The magic bullet theory is what it's called. Effectively, it did something highly improbable with respect to physics. There's all sorts of questions raised by what's missing with the Warren Commission report. And part of that, I think, is a function of technology, that forensic technology wasn't as advanced as it is now. And also, obviously, there wasn't enough real-time video evidence of the whole scene. There's all sorts of issues with how the commission went about its investigations. But obviously, they didn't talk to this surgeon, apparently, who is still alive and is giving testimony. And the big one was they didn't hire outside investigators to double-check their work, right? They only used their own investigators from the government. And the problem when you have something like that, if you don't have some external auditing of what you're doing, it has the possibility to create a narrative that isn't necessarily as wide in its perspective, meaning that there's certain pressures to present a narrative or present a sort of unanimity of belief that isn't necessarily encompassing the full situation.
Sure, yeah, governments or public investigators want to look authoritative, and to look authoritative, I don't know if suppressed is the right word, but the answers are presented as definitive.
I don't know that I would call it suppressed necessarily. It's just that the expediency of it, the fact that it didn't spend as much time as it could have, meant that things were missed. And the value of something like the Warren Commission is that it's the same reason you have coroners declare somebody dead, is that you have an official statement.
Great analogy.
From the government of, this is what we think happened. Here's the evidence we have to present for why we think this is what happened. But there were certain issues, obviously, right? So the main person they suspected died. right? Because he got shot by,
Jack Ruby.
yeah, Jack Ruby. And so that severely limited their options, but it also created a convenient scapegoat, right? If somebody that they got into custody then quickly died, you can't interrogate a dead person and you can't receive any testimony or evidence from a dead person. That created a very convenient, very easy answer. And people like having answers because it allows the government to move on. You're not always backward looking. And that's one of the issues actually I have with this sort of, I don't know that I'd call it conspiracy theories, but this obsession of looking backwards all the time with
Yeah.
government resources is that at some point, everyone has to just acknowledge, yeah, a terrible thing happened, but you have to move forward instead of backwards because if you're stuck in the past, then the past just becomes a sort of all consuming thing.
Like with COVID, yeah.
Sure. And that's the big criticism. COVID's actually a really good example right now. There, COVID's still actively infecting people around the world. If the government's decided that healthy people and certain categories of people just can't receive the COVID vaccine anymore. It's completely bizarre and irrational, foreclosing the possibility that people can even receive a vaccine that's already been proven to be at least more effective at preventing the spread of something than the alternative, which is not vaccinating people. It boggles my mind because we still have the flu vaccine, all the different iterations of the flu many years after the first time the flu was affecting populaces. So it's one of those things where I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase it. It's like a moral panic. It captures a hold of the imagination of the public for some topics where invest just exorbitant amounts of resources into things that aren't necessarily what I call a priority. So the big one was that I remember was the
Satanic panic.
for childcare. If you read about it, it's the weirdest thing where they invested just huge amounts of resources and the torches and the pitchforks, right, into these bizarre claims that there were satanic rituals being done at childcare facilities all around the U.S. And it's just the weirdest. Like these things happen sometimes with government. Probably the worst case example is witches and the Inquisition and chasing down devilry and all that, because that captured many countries and a lot of resources of the church. In some cases, it's the politics of distraction, right? That there's certain constituencies that will elect people just to look for this stuff, just to talk about this stuff. Because if you're looking at this stuff and you're talking about this stuff, you're not addressing all the other stuff. And there's a whole element of politics in the United States that unfortunately gravitates towards this.
I think you've struck on something by calling it a moral panic, but of course it's been going on. It's like a moral panic in the slow pot. Like a moral panic on simmer, but not on boil, for a long time, which never quite dies out and gets fed by the latest grievance.
The issue actually, I think, has to do with the how definitive the answer was. So for the Warren Commission, they said we know it was one guy, and that's it. And it foreclosed the possibility of any other situation or circumstance by not, because instead of saying, oh, we don't know, or there's other possibilities that we maybe just didn't look into as much as we could have, it said, we know it was this guy. The end.
They wanted people not to wonder, and they've been wondering since.
Yeah. To give you an example of a different commission that did at least a marginally better job of answering some of the questions, but also leaving open the possibility that there's things that weren't known, was the 9/11 Commission. They start out saying, look, it was a failure of imagination, meaning we did not know everything. And we, because of the limits of our understanding of things, we didn't quite conceptualize the notion that this could have happened or that this could happen again in a similar fashion. So we have to change how we look at the possibility of things. And that's a different kind of response. This is what we'll do better. As opposed to the Warren Commission was, this is the end, books closed, right? Not this is how we'll do better. It's this is what happened. Stop asking questions about it. That just led people to ask more questions. So that's why I think people still look at it and have these conspiracy theories. But again, that's 70 years in the past now. At some point, you have to move on. You can't keep looking backwards. There's a road ahead.
Sure, 60 to 70, yeah. So, true, but okay, so this guy, the witness who was a surgeon, it sounds to me like you're mostly commenting on the fixation of it and how attempts to authoritatively close the book have done the opposite. But the surgeon himself Sounds like he was just a guy with information that they tried to wrap it up too quickly to get to. So it doesn't sound like you think that he's an old man in his dotage.
No, so if he has contemporary reports of what happened in real time, if he was the one who received the president at the hospital, then obviously he should have been talked to by the Warren Commission to understand contemporaneously what happened in terms of his medical opinion. And if he was the guy that was providing that emergency medical, and for all I can tell, he was. It doesn't seem like there's anyone really contesting that he was the guy. He was one of the people who was there providing medical care. Then he's got a valuable insight. It's just the question is what the utility is of it now, right? What do we gain? The only thing I can think of is that I guess that's why people are trying to push for the documents to be released as well, is that whoever or whatever, if there were more people involved, may still be alive, or the organizations may still be around that were involved. And there is utility in trying to prevent any kind of future organized crime or damage. If you were to try to create an understanding of organized crime, for example, in the United States, there is utility in understanding where it starts or who the actual power players are, or if there is something like that existing where there's some kind of power out there that operated with pretty much impunity at the highest level against the highest levels of government in the United States and got away with it. There is value in understanding that because it shows a vulnerability in the system in terms of protecting anyone. And there is real value. That's why people study history, is what lessons can you learn from the past to apply to now? And obviously there were lessons to be learned from what happened many years ago. In particular, that the car needed to be covered and reinforced, that you can't drive around in a convertible when there's such a great risk, and that there's limits to being able to protect someone, period, and that you have to take those limits into account, right? And obviously those changes have been implemented, right? The car is much more robust and technologically advanced. There's all sorts of safeguards that were put in place after the fact. And there are lessons from history, so there is value there. It's just not so clear that the doctor is the one that is going to provide that value, other than changing the narrative that was presented. And if it does change the narrative, if there were more than one shooters, then the question becomes, who were the other shooters?
Right.
What was
Yeah.
their affiliation? Were they acting in concert or were they acting separately? Because people have motivations that can be completely different, and there can be weird coincidences that happen. It's those kinds of questions, though. But also, there's the mystery, right? That year after year, the government kept all the records under seal. And every time it got to the deadline of, well, we have to release them to the public for public information requests, a bunch of presidents said, nah, we're just going to keep extending this deadline. And the question then becomes, why? What are they hiding in these documents that, compared to all other documents that exist that the government releases to the public for public domain, or whatever you want to call it, of information that people can study to understand history? I think Trump said he was going to release at least some of, if not all of these documents, but why did they keep getting renewed? What were the pressures there? And what's going on there? I think that's why it captures the public imagination, because it exists in fiction a lot. There's been plenty of movies about it and shows. If you go
Yeah.
there, there's a museum. They lay out all the theories. When I judged for a debate in Dallas, we went to the museum there, the book observatory thing, and they have they
Yeah.
lay out all the different theories and the evidence, and they have this whole model where they show all the different theories that were presented. And that obviously it's still a question that captures the imagination. One, that it happened, but two, that it happened flagrantly, that it was so
Yes.
public. I understand that part of it, but it's like a hobby of people to study this and talk about it. The question is whether there's value in using public resources, taxpayer dollars still, to investigate this, considering all the other things that are happening right now in the world. That's just the big question. If you leave it to the academics or if you leave it to government. And that's my criticism is, yeah, I get that they brought the guy, but it's, again, this is way after we don't have hearings on all the other guys, on Teddy Roosevelt or the guy who got sick. This is
Right.
way after the
Let's
fact.
say, and there's no
Lincoln,
Bigfoot hearings.
where's the Lincoln hearings?
Yeah,
How much
right.
controversy is there about that?
Shouldn't
Had
we really be learning the truth behind the whiskey rebellion? People still drink whiskey every day. So anyway, yeah, because Regarding the facts of his testimony, if there were two wounds on JFK, and in particular if they came in two different directions, that would imply multiple actors. But of course, given Lee Harvey Oswald's quick death, that couldn't verify it one way or another in a definitive manner, it would always be a he said, she said. It's kind of, once Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald, that made this something of an unanswerable question. Because I can think of a scenario in which it might have been a foreign government, just for example, like Cuba, just for example, and the U.S. government was like, if people thought that our leaders could just be gunned down, then we would look weak, and it's not good to look weak, not good for anybody if we look weak, so we're gonna conclude that he was a Lone Ranger.
The worst one would actually be if it was a rogue element of allies of the US.
Yes.
Say there was some splinter group or some radical element of some country that we need as an ally for national security reasons. It would create a serious level of discord and division within the political discussions in the country if it came out that one of our allies didn't have as good a grasp on its criminal element, or if it was some secret plot to change politics for whatever reason, right? Because remember, this was the Cold War, so there were a lot of different moving parts of different clandestine action, spies, and a lot of Tinker Tailor Soldier spy stuff of the Velvet Glove and all that. So James Bond stuff of a lot of secretive, very mercurial stuff going on where you don't necessarily know the motivations of people who are doing things as to why they're doing them until way after the fact. And so that's the question that I've always wondered, is if it was some kind of Cold War espionage thing of the sort of behind the scenes, like spy versus spy battle, that we were just seeing like the end result of a long back and forth between spies. We don't know.
Yeah, and if you have a big war, and we're talking World War II big, I don't even think we're talking Vietnam big as it relates to the U.S., but if you have a gigantic war, and your country does not get ravaged, and you win, then usually you get a post-war bust, then you get a post-war boom, and then you get a post-war bust. That's just in economics, but you generally get a little bit of tranquility after the fact, because, okay, a lot of these people were soldiers, and you gotta have a certain degree of competence to be a soldier, so now they're in society, and they've integrated. So there's the good element of that, but there's also got to be destructive elements, because they killed people, and that doesn't leave you. It could have been rogue elements. You don't even know how many potential factions there would be. But my point is that as soon as Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald, it was always going to be, you couldn't definitively say. And another level of it is Jack Ruby could have worked for whoever it was. The government, a foreign government, a terrorist, or he could have worked for them, or he could have worked for nobody. And all of these things would have been possible. It says nothing about the actual conspiracy. So it's a pity, but some knowledge is just gone.
For sure, that it's just the limits of technology at the time, also the limits of their investigation that they self-imposed, right? That they didn't spend enough money, that they didn't hire additional investigators. There's a whole list of things they could have done that they didn't do, that you would expect they should have done for an investigation that was trying to seek the actual truth. And that's just the way it goes. I think there were political pressures to arrive at a conclusion, in part because of the whole issue that you needed the country to move on, right? That there were other things that needed to be focused on. And if you had a definitive statement, you could say, look, we have a definitive statement, let's move on.
There's our definitive statement. Let's move on to Priced Out. There's a bunch of teachers in Bentonville, Arkansas. Bentonville is the hometown of Walmart and other Fortune 500 companies. A foundation in Bentonville is working with an 11-acre plot to build below-market housing to rent to teachers, because teachers don't make terribly much in most of the country. Here in the Puget Sound region, they actually do make a fair deal. They don't make software money. I'm not saying they make a lot. A teacher may well be making $100,000 in the Puget Sound region. But in a lot of the country, they need a lot of schooling, and they aren't making amounts commensurate with that large amount of schooling that they need. So, an organization is offering to teachers below market housing. Initially, I hear that and I think, oh, how far we've fallen. You can't even pay them. There's no politically viable way that you can pay them a wage that will garner them any kind of advancement or wealth security, so you just house them as well. What is this? Germany circa 1900, where the workers live in barracks designed to house as many people as possible? So that was my initial reaction. And then I thought of it, and I thought, if it's good housing, it's like a salary supplement. I'd take it. If it was good enough housing, I'd do it. I don't know. What do you think of the story, and do you think that economies of scale can be used to help teachers or people?
I have a couple thoughts. So I do have one issue with the process they're doing in Arkansas, that it's a lottery, that who would need it could get it. The fact that it is, that there's any element of chance or uncertainty, means that someone's going to lose out. That's one way you hurt morale and create discord in any kind of labor force, is that if some people are gaining an advantage doing the same job, there's issues of fairness in terms of the way that they're being compensated. But aside from that, it actually makes a lot of sense due to the way that school districts work in the United States. So if you look at how school districts function, they're like their own little kingdoms because they have land, they have resources, they have assets. They get a lot of their money from tax levies on property taxes and the local tax base. And the big issue is that a lot of these school districts don't necessarily have money coming in terms of their operating expenses that can go towards paying teachers more. But what they do have, almost all of them, is land, and they have extra land that, in a sense, means that they can use that as part of the leverage they can have in recruiting and retaining teachers. And so, in that sense, I do think it's a very good idea for virtually all school districts to really seriously, because they need teachers, right? The demand is very much there, and there's a shortage in some parts of the country because teachers just, you're right, if they're not being compensated enough to live in a place, it's not everybody that wants to commute 2 or 3 or 4 hours because they're priced out of anywhere else within the vicinity of their job. And this is happening a lot actually in the West Coast, in some of these cities that have exorbitant housing prices. We're talking 1.5 million, 2 million, $3 million for the average home price, which is just ridiculously high in some of those tech places. And even if you're paying teachers way above the market rate of salary, they still can't, in some cases, afford to actually live anywhere near the schools. And so you've got schools in some of these very high income areas also doing this. And the whole issue is that you need housing separate from market forces. You need housing that just is there no matter what. And this is actually pretty common for, if you look at royalty, they have a little cottage for their gardeners or their support staff. Downton Abbey is a show that actually shows us a lot, where you've got accommodations for the people who you want to have working for you, but there's no realistic world where they're like suddenly going to afford to live on this very expensive land without some dispensation from their employer. Same deal here, that these teachers are providing for both private schools and public schools a service that they're being paid for, but they're clearly not being paid enough. And so I think it's a great idea, but I think this should apply for virtually every job, right? It's not just teachers, it's also cops, firefighters, nurses, all the hospital support staff in some of these major cities that have to like bus in, or they have to commute by train, or they have to drive in. And that just really sucks for roads and congestion in the environment, that you have people that just constantly have to drive in from all over the place. So what I do think is, well, it's a great idea for teachers. It's a model that needs to be applied for literally everybody who can't afford. That's a public worker in particular, where your job is tied to a place. There needs to be some kind of mechanism in place all across the country for allowing these public workers to actually be able to live near where they work, especially first responders. I think it's important because you don't want cops and firefighters who are just incredibly exhausted because their commute takes so long, right? You want them refreshed and ready to do their job to save lives. It's same with EMTs, and the list goes on, that there is a need for affordable housing, and that the current model of tying all housing to market conditions is incredibly risky because, sure, it maintains high housing prices, but it results in this situation we've got where people are buying houses as a commodity like gold or a stock where they want the value to always go up, and you get negative externalities with that kind of situation where you get people who buy up a huge amount of properties so that they can raise the rents or they can raise the value, but in some cases they keep those properties empty because it's less profitable if you have a tenant, because you have to evict a tenant if you want to sell a property. So in some cases it makes economic sense, and this is why GDP as a measure of economic growth, sure, it's great, but the problem with GDP is it also measures really terrible things. If somebody's got huge amounts of gambling debt or healthcare debt and they're all declaring bankruptcies, someone's making money. It's just not those people who are declaring bankruptcy on their debt. Same kind of deal here. Just because you have a really strong economy doesn't mean everybody who participates in the economy gets to equally feel the benefits of that economy, right? Because of the wealth disparities in the United States, of the amount of wealth that's concentrated in the hands of the very few, the averages skew way up for average incomes. But if you take out the top, I think it's 1% or 2%, they go way down. They go down by almost half. You can say that there's money around, right? That people have available, and the politicians can do that, and they can go, oh, people can afford stuff, blah, blah, blah. No, they can't. No, the reality is that there's not enough houses, and of the houses that exist, they're very expensive because the available housing stock is held in the hands of people who want to make money. That makes sense, right? That is rational. That if you've got something that's worth something, that you want to make money from it. That's why shareholders of corporations sue when they're not making enough money. United Healthcare right now, where the shareholders are suing the company because they're not making as much money as they used to. The same kind of deal here. But the issue with public schooling and with public school teachers in particular is that it's tied to a physical location. So as a community grows or improves or gets better, which are great things, right? You want companies to succeed and corporations to grow. That raises the prices. And poor planning in the United States for housing construction, look, it's a whole thing that market incentives have created a situation where housing developers do not want to create low cost housing because it's not as profitable. And if you look at the current situation in the United States with tariffs, the price of inputs all across the board for labor, for all materials to build houses just went up because of tariffs on like wood and steel and metal and all the stuff to build houses. So just to recoup your costs, you have to increase the value of the home you're building, or you're not going to make enough money. And like this is all a failure in some senses of our society to account for the changes in market conditions. There's this weird disconnect, this dissonance between what we need, which is cops, firefighters, teachers, all these different government workers, etc., and what we have, which is not enough houses, right? And it's a whole thing. There's
Yeah.
one political party in particular that does things that make it worse, which is the Republicans. But this is a Democrat issue too. The New York Times had a pretty extensive article about how the Democrats talk a big game, but the actual outcomes in a lot of the West Coast cities is that there's more homelessness. There's a lot of NIMBYism that when they try to zone for denser housing, everybody comes out of the woodwork and they're like, oh, it's not great for the environment, or oh, I don't want to have a rehab facility or a homeless shelter or whatever right next to my neighborhood. Where the biggest issue that people would talk about in some of these neighborhoods was, oh, they're building a rehab facility for people who have drug substance abuse addictions, and I don't want it
Mhm.
built 2 blocks away or a mile away, or it's next to a school. That's terrible. We can't have a rehab facility for people who need help. No, I can't do that. It's like you have to have these somewhere,
You
right?
got to put it somewhere. Yeah.
And there are limits. The other issue, though, and this one's a much, in some cases, Trump's, I don't know that he's right, but he's on at least a different path, is that a huge amount of land is held in the hands of state government and the federal government. If you look at a map of how much land is held, especially west of the Mississippi, it's just a significant percentage of all land. That limits the amount of land available for private use, for housing
Yeah.
and all that other stuff. And so I think this is the answer in some cases, or the best answer, is that the government has a lot of land, but it doesn't have a lot of money due to tax revenue.
Right.
So do that. Give housing to people that isn't tied to the market. It
Yeah.
makes sense to me.
So it sounds to me like you agree that this is a good idea more than I thought you would, and that a house, and I would want it to be a good one, frankly, but like with enough space. A lot of these new things are like dorm rooms for adults. Stop making those. I don't mean stop, but people need large enough houses, and they don't need to be houses. They can be condos or whatever.
Look,
But
there actually is a parallel. Universities do this a lot. They have foreign professors that have on-campus housing that the university provides. That's probably the best parallel I can think of if you look at an existing system that does this.
sure, but people have a lot of their wealth tied up in houses, and you're right. They want the housing to be this finite good, and it's sticky in terms of what the quantity is, but it isn't finite, not in the same way as precious metals and other things that are. It's not only not finite in terms of we can build more, but it's not finite in terms of we don't even know that in a generation or so we're going to have as many young adults needing new houses. With birth rates looking like they are, it's looking like we won't. In other countries, it's looking that way. So if people expect their houses to go up in value forever, it's not going to happen. You need people to live in the houses. It may appear to be something that will always go up, but I can promise it isn't.
Sure, there's value in having the houses, even if they shut down school districts, for example, in the sense that if they're building new housing, it solves a different problem, which is that there's a shortage of affordable housing, period. And so if there are incentives on the part of entities that aren't tied to market conditions, that aren't trying to make a profit, then what happens is that if this becomes the model, even if the population declines, you still address a different issue, which is that you have affordable housing that you can use to benefit society as a whole. So a good example actually is I was reading an article about a mall in Washington where a school district had a bunch of buildings that they stopped using for their school for because they just didn't have enough students or demand or whatever. And so they leased out their buildings to businesses, but at a very low affordable rate for many years, which allowed for businesses to thrive in that location. Is that if you create situations where schools don't have to make the absolute utmost amount of money in order to give out the buildings once they're not using them, so long as they can recoup their costs or the maintenance or overhead or whatever, then you can create a situation where communities can still thrive even when the housing isn't going towards teachers, if it's going towards some other group. And there is value in that because what it means is that land that was otherwise going unused is becoming used. But there are actual parallels to this kind of thing that have existed for a long time. I'm thinking in particular of the Catholic Church. If you think of missionaries or Jesuits or just various groups that traveled around the world and lived in pretty rough conditions, the Catholic Church has, for a very long time, subsidized some of those missions in terms of education, but also in terms of things like hospitals, that for communities that need a hospital, they can operate as a nonprofit. So I do actually think that this is a better idea than some of the alternatives because some of the alternatives create really strange incentives in terms of how they would be recruiting teachers, and also just it would require raising taxes usually for compensating teachers more money. In this way, they don't have to raise taxes if they already have the properties. That's the big thing. A lot of these school districts, when they were first formed and as they grew over time, were given more land by the state or the communities. And so that creates a much easier fix in some senses. It's more pragmatic than the alternatives, which is raising taxes on people. And usually people don't like their taxes to be raised too much, right? Because there's all the other costs that people have to exist. So yeah,
Mhm.
no, I think it's a win-win. I just wish there was a model that applied to virtually all jobs that we require as a society to operate. So I'm thinking like sewage workers, cops, firefighters, any job that's paid by the public dime. They do it for wildland firefighters. They have accommodations for fire watchers. Do you know what a fire tower is? Where somebody sits and they
Yes.
just look at the woods all day, every day to see if there's smoke
Yes.
or fire. They do that, right? Because these areas are so remote and there's no houses in many miles direction. Like they have to build accommodations, or no one would do it. You're not going to tell someone, "Oh, live in a tent and watch the fires from this tiny little tower we've put up. No, you give people an actual quality of life because it's part of just recruiting people to do the job. So same deal here. It's impossible to, not impossible, but it's difficult unless somebody's already wealthy when they're applying to be a teacher to convince someone, oh, do this job in this place where you can't live unless you commute 5 hours a day and you have to wake up very early in the morning and leave late at night. Some people will do it, but not a lot. Yeah, the last word on this is that it's a good idea. I just wish it wasn't a lottery system that for anyone that needs it, they get it, period, because otherwise you create division and it hurts morale. So that's just my thought on that.
Mondays with Mike.